それでは、時間になりましたので、そろそろ研究会を開始させていただこうというふうに思います。本日は溶けるような暑さの中お集まりいただきましてありがとうございます。バナキュラー文化研究会主催で、立命館大学の国際言語文化研究所共催で、本日は、アメリカの南イリノイ大学から、マシュー・ペットウェイ先生に、お越しいただいて、弟を探して植民地時代キューバにおける奴隷制の影というタイトルの講演を、させていただきます。で、今日の、講演の、全体の構成なんですけれども、まず最初に、僕の方から、今回の研究会の趣旨説明、それからおそらくは多くの皆さんにとって、この、植民地時代のキューバの奴隷制であったりとか、あるいは詩人についてっていうのはあまり知識がないんじゃないかというふうに思いますので、簡単な背景説明を最低30分ぐらいさせていただこうと思います。で、その後に、マシュー先生の方から、講演をしていただきまして、5分から10分ぐらいの休憩を挟んで、その後、僕が簡単に講演の話をまとめまして、コメントそれから質問をさせていただいて、その後全体での質疑応答という流れを考えております。はい、でですね、結構言語的に複雑な今回の講演会でして、というのはまずその研究の分析の対象となるのがキューバということで、そしてまた特に注目される詩人が書いた言葉はスペイン語なんですね。ということで分析するテキストはスペイン語なんですが、ご講演いただくペットウェイ先生は英語母語者で、講演は英語で行われます。で、肝心の司会とそのコメントをする僕なんですけれども、英語が非常にお粗末でして今日は英語に関してはこの場に集まっていただいている研究会のメンバーにすっかり頼ろうというふうに思っています。で、ということで僕の方は日本語を使い、そしてスペイン語を使いながら、マシュー先生、ペットウェイ先生とは、スペイン語あるいはちょっと英語も交えながらということがあるかと思うんですけれども、ちょっと特殊ですけれども、参加者の皆さんにもいろいろ協力していただいて、なんとかこの講演会が皆さんにとってなんか緑にあるものになるように、したいというふうに考えています。はい、それでは早速趣旨説明および背景解説の方からさせていただこうと思います。はい、でまず今回バナキュラ研究会が主催ということで、この研究会についてごく簡単にだけ紹介させていただこうというふうに思います。でそもそもバナキュラという言葉にあまり聞き覚えがないかもしれませんけれども、簡潔にまとめると、ある共同体に固有の言語とか生活に密着した伝統や文化のことを言っていて、公的権威を持たないものというのが大きな特徴と言えるかと思います。語源に遡るとラテン語のベルナクルスという言葉に遡って、その意味は主人の家で生まれた奴隷とかその土地で生まれた人を意味します。ですが、最初の語義として定着したのは公用語としてのラテン語、普遍性や中心性や公的権威を持つラテン語との対比において、地方語であったり俗語を指す言葉として定着しました。そのラテン語との関係性においては、土着性や周縁性や混交性、可変性などといった特徴が挙げられ、つまり権力を撹乱するような潜在的可能性を持つ言葉というふうに考えることもできます。このバナキュラという言葉は特に最近では文化人類学、民族学においても使われる言葉になっているわけですが、フォークロアからこのバナキュラへの語の転換というものが起こっています。というのは、フォークロアというのは意味は民の伝承というような意味ですが、これが民族精神の表れとして ナショナリズムと結びついたり、あるいは過去の遺物、文化的更新性のイメージといったものが付着してしまっているのに対して、バナキュラ、もともとそのための伝承というものは、決してその過去の遺物ではなくて、絶えず変化をするものです。そういった、創造性など、そういったものに注目をした語彙として注目されています。ということで、バナキュラ文化研究、僕たちが、取り組んでいるこの研究というのは、どういうことに注目してやっているかというと、話し言葉と文字、ローカルチャーとハイカルチャーを区別するのではなく、両者の影響や交渉、変容などの相互作用に光を当てるという狙いを持った取り組みをしています。このような研究会なんですけれども、今回ペトウェイ先生をお迎えして、このキューバの文学の話をしていただくわけですが、中心となる詩人がこのフランシスコ・マンサノという詩人です。で、彼はまさにこのバナキュラの語源であるウェルナクルスであって、つまり主人の家で生まれた奴隷という身分でした。そして彼は幼少期は話し言葉、あるいはアフリカの伝統の世界の中に生きた人です。けれども、この後話をするように、マンサノはやがて逃亡し、白人作家たちとの、からの協力を得ながら、文字と西洋文学の知識を習得し、詩や自伝などを執筆します。そのような、彼の経歴を考えたときに、彼の作品というのはまさにバナキュラ文化研究で注目されるような人物というふうに考えることができるだろうと思います。今日注目するフランシスコ・マンサノという詩人について簡単な略歴を、この後ペトウェイ先生からも話があると思うんですけれども、略歴についてです。彼は1797年にキューバのハバナで生まれたと考えられています。で、両親は家事労働奴隷でした。家事労働奴隷者でした。奴隷という身分ではあるんですけれど、家事労働というのは、その労働の奴隷の労働の中でも比較的楽な仕事、つまりプランテーションの農園でこういう暑い日にサトウキビを買ったりするっていうようなことがないような仕事ではあるので、奴隷の中では比較的高い身分になります。からマンサノ自身も決してずっとサトウキビ畑で働いていたというような奴隷ではなくて、比較的高い身分にあった奴隷ということになります。ですが、彼はプラド・アメーノ公爵夫人によってちょっとしたいたずらなんかに対しても非常に厳しい罰を受けるという虐待を受けて、農園から逃亡します。実はこの前の年に母親が亡くなっていて、その前にも父親が亡くなっていて、もうすでに両親を亡くしていた状態でした。で、逃亡奴隷となってハバナに移動するんですけれど、そこで白人の反奴隷主義の作家のグループたちの協力を得ながら1835年に自伝を執筆します。で、これは当時キューバはスペインの植民地で、その反抗的な、あるいはその制度に対する反対するようなことは当然検閲の対象になったので、キューバで出版することはできずに1840年にイギリスで出版されています。で、この1836年頃に、その自伝は実はこれを書いたら自由の身分を得る協力をするという白人作家たちの支援を得ていたわけなんですけれども、結果的にマンサノは自由黒人となります。その後は仕立て屋とか菓子職人とか料理人といったような仕事に就いていました。で、今日分析される詩「夢弟へ」という詩は1838年に文芸誌、キューバの文芸誌の「エル・アルブム」という雑誌に掲載されました。その前にもマンサノの詩っていうのは1821年頃、つまり逃亡してからですね、キューバで詩集とか新聞とか雑誌に掲載されていて、比較的名の知れた詩人でした。そんなマンサノの活動ですけれど、1844年にはしごの陰謀という事件が起こります。これは主にその白人の反奴隷主義者とか自由黒人や奴隷たちが協力して反乱を起こしているという計画、これが 暴露して鎮圧される。で多くの自由黒人や奴隷たちが、拷問を受けたり殺害されたりというような事件でした。これに対する弾圧でマンサノは協力していたと疑われて1年間投獄され、その後作品の発表はなくなっています。はい、で主な舞台となるハバナとそれからマタンサスの地理的、位置の確認です。彼はハバナで生まれたというふうに考えられていて、これはキューバの全土の地図ですが、19世紀の、キューバの地図ですが、ハバナはここにあります。でマタンサスという町はここです。だいたい東にハバナから100キロぐらいのところにあります。なのでハバナに生まれて、後にこのマタンサスに行って、マタンサスの農園で奴隷として働いていたということなんですが、先ほど言ったように、虐待を受けてそこから逃亡しハバナに戻ったというような形です。大体それを6日間かけて徒歩で移動したというふうに、言われています。でこのマタンサスという町についての簡単な紹介なんですが、ただのど田舎ということではなくて、まずサトウキビプランテーションが非常に発達した町の一つでした。これマタンサスの、マンサノがいた農園ではないんですけれど、その頃マタンサスにあった農園の、リトグラフになります。鉄道なんかも敷設されていて、砂糖工場もかなり近代的なものになっていたということがこれで分かります。でマンサノはここで、家の中で主に働いていたということなんですけれども、彼には兄弟が、何人かいました。で弟のフロレンシオっていうのがこの詩の中に出てくるんですけれども、そういった弟なんかを残してこの森の農園っていうところから逃亡します。他方でこういったプランテーションが発達した一方で、町の方は1813年には印刷機が導入されて文芸活動が発展していました。キューバに限らず、ラテンアメリカ全体で最初の、ロマン主義詩人というふうにも評されるホセ・マリア・エレディアなんかは、このマタンサスという町で弁護士の仕事に就いていました。それからまた今日重要な、人物として出てくるドミンゴ・デル・モンテという、白人のクリオーリオ、キューバ生まれ、ごめんなさい、ベネズエラ生まれですけれどキューバに、移住した人ですが、彼を中心とする反奴隷主義文芸サークルの活動はハバナとそれからこのマタンサスで行われていました。でこの文芸サークルにおいて、このマタンサスから逃亡してきた、マンサノに対して、自伝を執筆する代わりにその自由を得るように協力を、援助をしたというのがこのグループになります。結局その自伝を執筆した後に実際に彼は自由の身分を手に入れることになります。これがマタンサスの、町の絵です。祭りの時の絵です。で、キューバの奴隷貿易と、それからちょっと今日一つ重要なポイントになってくるコンゴの宗教観について、宇宙観について話をしておこうと思うんですけれど、これがアフリカで、こちらが南アメリカで、キューバが上の方にありますが、キューバにはアフリカのさまざまな地域から、特に西海岸の方から多くのアフリカ人奴隷が、連れて行かれましたが、特に文化的な重要性を持っている民族として、この辺にあるヨルーバという民と、それからコンゴですね。このコンゴの文化的影響というのは今日でも大きな痕跡を残しています。で今日話で出てくるのがこのコンゴの宇宙観なんですけれど、レグラス・コンゴスというふうに、言いますが、バントゥー系で、バコンゴあるいはバコンゴという民族の宗教基礎に、生まれたのがこのレグラス・コンゴスというふうに呼ばれます。特にキューバではパロモンテっていうのが有名なんですけれど、パロモンテというのもこの、バコンゴの一つの宗教になります。でその特徴として、祖先や死者の霊とか自然の精霊を崇拝するという特徴があります。これは、多分僕たち日本人にとっては比較的理解しやすい世界観じゃないかというふうに思うんですけれども、そのような考え方が彼らにはあります。今後の宗教にはあります。 で、後からまた時間があったら話はしたいと思うんですが、特にヨルバの方では、カトリックとそれからヨルバの民のシンクレティズム、集合が起こって、特に複雑な、神々の信仰体系というのが生まれた一方で、コンゴの方は何で有名かというと魔術の方で有名です。そういった例ですね。特に、このキシが単数形でミンキシというのが複数形なんですけれど、聖なる薬草とか、あるいは病気や害を治す死者の霊のことをキシ、あるいは複数形でミンキシというふうに言います。こういったものに対する信仰があります。他方で全てがこういったものがいい霊ということではなくて、逆に病気や害をもたらす悪い霊というのもあります。その場合はンドキという言葉があります。で、こういった霊を使った魔術っていうのが、コンゴの信仰体系では有名で、特にこの死者の骨なんかを入れた呪物っていうのをンガンガっていうふうに言いますが、ンガンゲロ、こういった呪物を使った魔術師ですね、ンガンゲロとかマジョンベロというふうに言うんですけれども、そういった精霊とか霊とか、こういった呪物を使った魔術を行う信仰体系として、このコンゴはよく知られています。はい、でこれで、大体最後の方になるんですけれど、キューバの奴隷制とそれから反奴隷主義について最後に少しまとめておこうと思います。キューバに奴隷制が導入されたのはもう1511年頃、アメリカ大陸が発見されて本当にすぐのことです。で、キューバでは奴隷制が完全に廃止されるのは1886年ということで、かなり長い間奴隷制が続きました。で、キューバは主にそのスペイン人が探したのは金とか銀で、キューバで別に金とか銀が出てきたわけではなくて、やっぱりメキシコとか今のペルーの方の金銀なんかをやっぱスペイン人はターゲットとして渡っていったわけなんですけれど、キューバは何で栄えたかというと、そういった金銀が一旦キューバに運ばれて、そこからスペインに渡る、つまり貿易の中継地点としてキューバは発展していました。ところが1791年にハイチ革命が隣のハイチで起こります。そうするとサトウキビ農園っていうのがもう焼き尽くされて、当時ハイチは世界最大の砂糖生産国だったんですけれど、もう焼き尽くされてしまうということになりました。そうするとそのハイチの方から、例えば白人農園者であったりとか黒人奴隷なんかが一部キューバに渡ってきます。そしてその技術なんかが伝えられ、ハイチに代わる砂糖生産国としてキューバはこの18世紀の終わり19世紀に入ってから急激に発展を遂げるんですね。けれども間もなくしてイギリスで奴隷貿易の禁止が1807年に決まります。そうするとやっぱりイギリスなんかはいまだにその奴隷貿易を続けている国に対してこれをやめるべきだというプレッシャーをかけていきます。そしてスペインとイギリスの間では1817年に奴隷貿易を禁止するという取り決めが行われ、1820年にそれが実際に施行されるんですけれど、この1820年以降に密貿易が横行します。でこの1821年から1860年の間に35万人以上の奴隷がキューバに入ってきたというふうにデータが出ています。キューバは比較的なのでずっと中継地点として栄えていたということもあって、植民地時代の初期からたくさんのアフリカ人奴隷が連れてこられたっていうわけではなかったんですね。かなり白人の人口も多かった。ところがこの段階になって急激にアフリカ人奴隷が増加することによって、この19世紀半ばぐらいになると白人の人口よりも黒人の人口の方が多くなります。こういうことが起こって現地生まれの白人たち、クリオーリョというふうに言いますけれど、この白人クリオーリョ自由主義者たちですね、彼らはキューバがアフリカ化するんじゃないかというような危惧を感じ、そしてまた、この段階になってくるとある程度キューバにおいて独自の文化っていうのも大体出てきています。そうするとスペイン支配に対する不満が生まれ、またキューバのアイデンティティが芽生え、キューバらしさのようなものを追求するということが行われていきます。 で先ほどから名前が出ているこのドミンゴ・デル・モンテっていうのはまさにそういった中の一人の知識人ということです。ということで、その彼らの活動っていうのは必ずしもその人道的に黒人を助けるということだけではなくて、彼らなりのその目的もあって、独立とまではいかなくてもそのキューバのアフリカ人の急激な増加を止めるとか、あるいはスペインからの一定の経済的な自立であるとか、そういった目的を持ちながらの活動だったということです。この中でさまざまな文学作品も生まれるんですけれど、基本的には書いているのは白人作家です。白人作家が書いていて、この奴隷制の犠牲者となっている従順な黒人が描かれているというのがおよその共通点として認められます。このような活動の中でフランシスコ・マンサーノもまたここに協力し、そして彼らから協力することで自由を得た詩人ということです。一応僕からの背景説明は以上で、マシュー先生のペットウェイ先生のご紹介を、してバトンタッチしようと思うんですけれど、ご本人がいる前で紹介しようと思ったんですが、マシュー・ペットウェイ先生ですけれども、ミシガン州のデトレイト出身で、ミシガン州立大学のヒスパニック・カルチャル・スタディーズにて博士号を取得されています。これまでの研究、その後の研究活動として、ラングストン・ヒューズ・ビジティング・プロフェッサーシップとか、2014年にはテキサス大学において、ビジティング・スカラーとして研究を行ってこられました。で、現在は南イリノイ大学の准教授をされています。ご研究は植民地時代、キューバだけではなくて今は結構ブラジルにも注目されているということを聞いたんですけれども、ラテンアメリカにおける黒人奴隷が試みた抵抗と自由の史学の歴史的文学的研究に取り組んでおられます。でこれがペトウェイ先生のご著書なんですけれども、Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection という本で、マンサノという詩人のほかに、この頃キューバでは自由黒人の詩人で、プラシドという人がいたんですが、その詩人2人の詩人を中心に、新たな読みの可能性を探求されておられます。でこの本ですが、ユーロスパンブックストアコムというところでジャパン25っていうふうにコードを入れると、少し割引が確認しましたけど8ドルちょっとぐらいか1000円ぐらいの割引になってますけど、多分届くのにすごい時間がかかるということと郵送代ってかかりましたかないですか。はい。ということなんで、Amazon とかでも、購入できますので、もしご関心があればぜひ手に取っていただけたらというふうに思います。はい、それではマシュー先生帰ってこられましたのでご紹介したいと思います。今日これからご講演いただく、マシュー・ペットウェイ先生です。皆さん拍手でお迎えください。
Good afternoon. Konnichiwa. 私は Pettway 先生です。And I am very honored to be here today. I'm going to ask how I should maneuver. Is it working now, the pointer? Can everyone hear me? Okay. What did you ask? Oh, yes. So once again, I want to say good afternoon. I am beyond happy to be here in Kyoto, Japan, and very happy to present on my book, Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, Manzano, Plácido, and Afro-Latino Religion. And I want to dedicate my talk today to someone very dear to me that inspired the writing of the book, and particularly the chapter that this lecture is based on, to Timothy, my lost brother, a poetic genius and a gentle man who lost the battle with the words teeming in his head. May he rest in peace. The lecture that I'm giving today about Juan Francisco Manzano is fundamentally a lecture about families of African descent who are torn asunder by the violence of white supremacy functioning in Spanish colonialism in the 19th century. Cuba replaces Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, as the most productive sugar-producing colony in the world, and in the process of doing so, destroys many families of African descent. I want to encourage us today, however, to think about survival. And I ponder what we might learn about the descendants of the enslaved Africans if we consider their religious practices as an imperative, as necessary for cultural survival. When is survival radical? And what did Black radical love look like in Cuba in 1838, when Manzano published the poem, A Dream for My Second Brother? How did Manzano appropriate the aesthetic and spiritual tools available to him to liberate not only himself, but his family? Juan Francisco Manzano is believed to have been born in 1797 and to have died in 1853, was the only enslaved Spanish-American writer known to have written a personal account of his life in bondage. His autobiografía represents the genesis of Cuban narrative. Most scholars agree that Manzano was born in Havana in 1797. He was raised on a Matanzas sugar plantation of the Marchioness Beatriz Justiz de Santa Ana and Don Juan de Cárdenas y Manzano. His mother, Maria de Pilar, was a handmaiden, and his father, Toribio Castro, the lead manservant, as well as a gifted harpist. Manzano had 3 younger brothers, Florencio, Fernando, and another whose name remained anonymous. His sister, Maria de Rosario, was granted freedom at birth and received formal schooling. Although we know very little about his siblings, his slave narrative and lyric poetry display a deep sense of affection for them and represents the pain wrought by his forced separation from family and childhood. And I'm going to see if this is working. Do I point in this direction? Oh. So this is a map, a 19th century map of Cuba. Ambo Sensei had some also very good maps of Cuba. And I want to take a moment just to review some of the basic biographical information about Juan Francisco Manzano. I want you to try to imagine Manzano walking the streets of Havana and Matanzas, and to think of him, if you're familiar with the African-American writer Frederick Douglas, who wrote famous slave narratives, as a Cuban Frederick Douglass, although he published prior to Douglas. Born in 1797, what's important for my lecture is that Manzano's mother charged him with taking care of his siblings upon her death. So Manzano's father died first, we don't know the year. Then Manzano's mother, prior to death, charged him with taking care of his siblings. Manzano escaped the Matanzas sugar plantation in 1817. I know that was part of the presentation because I understand Arabic numerals. In Havana, Manzano taught himself to read and write. He was an autodidact, self-taught like Frederick Douglass, and he availed himself of elite literary networks to publish his collections of poetry. 1821 and 1830 are those two first collections of poetry. But it's his latter work where Manzano, and unpublished poems, where Manzano would convey an abolitionist or anti-slavery position. Manzano was informed that his freedom would be purchased for him if he wrote a slave narrative, an autobiografía, an autobiography of his life. Something he did, though it caused him great difficulty, something he did begrudgingly. And this is something that we know because of the letters he published, 7 letters that he wrote, not published, 7 letters to his benefactor, a white reformist by the name of Domingo del Monte, who was concerned with ending the slave trade to Cuba so that Cuba would not follow in the political footsteps of Saint-Domingue, the French colony where Africans destroyed the power of the French Empire and defeated Napoleon, creating the first Black Republic in 1804. So this is what Del Monte wants to do because his wealth depended on African enslavement. The quid pro quo Manzano accepts. He wrote his autobiography in exchange for his freedom, 1835/1836. But 1836, we know he was freed because we have a document clarifying that. And his autobiography was published in London in 1840. Also, in 1835, Manzano began to negotiate the freedom of his brother, once again, to fulfill his mother's trust. The poem that I will be analyzing today, Un sueño a mi segundo hermano, a dream to my second brother, was published after Manzano was liberated in 1838. And is significant because by the time Manzano published this poem in El Album, as Ambo Sensei mentioned, both Manzano's father and mother were deceased. Both had died by that time. I will analyze A Dream to My Second Brother, a poem that Manzano dedicated to his younger brother, Florencio, who languished in bondage long after Manzano escaped to Havana. My reading of the poem will highlight 3 themes: dreams, radical love, and African spirituality or African-inspired spirituality, spirituality of an African matrix, as it has also been explained. The dreams in this poem are a gateway to the spirit world. More than a reflection of the unconscious, they are a gateway to the spirit world, but they are also a literary or aesthetic technique. Manzano uses the dreams purposely because the dreams provide him with greater freedom to write about things that the Spanish censors would have forbidden him to mention. Within the dream state, he can imagine whatever he likes, as long as he does not call for the execution of the queen, which he did not do. Radical love as a political praxis, okay? Radical love as the search for the emancipation or the freedom of others. And African spirituality as a knowledge system and a practice of freedom, as something that should be understood in opposition to Spanish Catholicism in many instances, not all instances, but in the instances that I'll be talking about today. Manzano's radical love for Florencio is both empathetic and salvific in nature. Salvific meaning that he's looking to save his brother. Manzano is deeply moved to act in the interest of liberating his younger brother. In short, I will demonstrate that Manzano's dream is a dream of Black liberation made possible by radical love. I contend that Manzano pursued this project of Black liberation through the lens of African spirituality. Literary critics have typically understood Juan Francisco Manzano as a poet of African descent that imitated white Cuban literary models so that his work would be published. Manzano has been seen in the main as an imperfect imitation of Spanish Catholic aesthetic norms. Worse still, scholars point out that his white patron, Domingo del Monte, edited, erased, and otherwise defaced his literary expression. In Literary Bondage, Slavery and Cuban Narrative, William Louis posits that Manzano's choice to embrace the conventions of literary discourse represented an abandonment of an African frame of reference. The late Miriam da Costa Willis, may she rest in peace, emphasizes racial identity of Manzano, and she concludes that Manzano was, quote, a tragic mulatto, mulatto being someone who is both black and white, and who fits into neither the black enslaved community or the free white community. A tragic mulatto. It's a racist term still used sometimes in Latin America. The whole idea of the mulatto is I think it's the horse and the donkey, the mixture of the horse and the donkey. And then the animal that results cannot reproduce. So it was a racist term. He was seen as a social misfit. And I argue that Juan Francisco Manzano, though he is subjected to the power of Spanish Empire, was born in Cuba as an enslaved person, was baptized as a Catholic, also maintained African spiritual beliefs, and that his family is the source of those spiritual beliefs. His mother played a major part. In order to understand my presentation today, in addition to having a basic understanding of the context, the historical context, we also need to talk about some terms. And so I want to speak about cosmology. But before we do so, I'm going to present you with a couple of images that will help you to understand enslavement as a ritual. I want to say briefly, I've done a bit of reading on the history of Japan. And if you're familiar with the 16th century and the arrival of Yasuke, who becomes Nobunaga's servant, then you know that the Portuguese in the 1500s, the mid-1500s, are bringing Africans to Japan against their will. The ritual of enslavement of African people is very old. It involves the Arab slave trade, which is prior to the Portuguese beginning the Atlantic slave trade in the 1500s. Japan avoids much of this violence because of the Edo period, the period of isolation. But Africans, by and large, were not able to avoid these forms of violence. And you can see here on, at least at my right, a mother being separated from her child. These are the normal types of violence that took place not only during the slave trade, but once Africans were in the Americas. On the left, you see a man being pilloried. His head is between two pieces of wood, and his hands, just his hands, not his arms, are between those two holes in the wood, and so he can't move. And this is a position of torture. And this was what was done to Juan Francisco Manzano. So Manzano's mother, Maria del Pilar, urges him to protect the family by making sure the family does not fall apart, is not torn asunder once she passes away. And particularly, she wants him to pursue his own freedom, to become free, so that he can then free his brothers. His sister was already free, Maria de Pilar. Okay, let's continue with regard to cosmology. Give you both of these. Cosmology is a philosophy that members of cultural communities from the Congo Basin in West Central Africa traditionally embody. Unlike doctrine, which has to be taught in churches or mosques or temples, cosmology is second nature to a cultural community, much in the same way that grammar is second nature to native speakers of any language. Wyatt McGaffey defines cosmology, quote, as a certain concept of the universe and the place of man within it, end quote. Human beings are socialized into the cosmology of their cultural communities. So be carrying out a particular practice, not necessarily being told why, but being told to do it, and doing that practice and shaping your life based upon a set of understandings, innate understandings, or they appear to be innate. So that cosmology should be thought of as a concept of the universe and knowing your place within it. An example would be understanding that you did not create yourself, that you were created by a greater power, that your ancestors are the conduit of your values, and that you need to communicate with your ancestors in some meaningful way. The way in which you communicate with the ancestor might vary from African ethnic group to another, okay? But I also want to talk about radical love. Joy Kennedy and Thomas Grinder rely on Black feminist and biblical paradigms to articulate their definition of radical love. They define radical love thus, quote, "We define the term radical love as the empathetic, active, and passionate impulse to transform social relationships in ways that seek justice and freedom. Accordingly, a radical kind of love seeks the liberation and well-being of others," end quote. So the radical love that Kennedy and Grinder are speaking of is not individualistic. It is not, I think, therefore I am, as Descartes said, but rather more Ubuntu, somos y somos, as they say in Cuba. I am because we are. My well-being is necessarily tied to yours. And this was certainly the case when Manzano was speaking about his birth family. Certainly the case when Manzano was speaking about his birth family. Juan Francisco Manzano's mother, Maria del Pilar Manzano, was in failing health. Maria del Pilar had already lost her husband, Toribio de Castro, a domestic manservant and a harpist, and the family's fortunes had changed for the worst after his death. The modicum of protection that Toribio was able to guarantee his family and his son Juan Francisco in particular had all but vanished. Maria del Pilar watched in horror as her son was beaten, publicly disgraced, pilloried, locked in a coal cellar, or placed in an old slave infirmary for the slightest of youthful blunders. The very notion of Black family was antithetical to the profit-driven slavery system. Cultural theorist Hortense Spillers, an African American, has written eloquently on this matter. Hortense Spillers writes, quote, "Certainly, if kinship were possible, the property relations would be undermined, since the offspring would then belong to the mother and the father. In the system that Frederick Douglass articulates, genetic reproduction becomes then not an elaboration of the life principle in his cultural overlap, but an extension of the boundaries of proliferating properties," end quote. So Spillers argues that the type of slavery that was practiced in the United States and in Cuba as well, I will argue, made kinship nearly impossible. It violated the principle of kinship. Manzano did not technically belong to his mother and did not technically belong to his father. And because if he did, then they would be able to leave the plantation or the slave labor camp. But instead, every time Manzano's mother gave birth, technically she was increasing the property. She was increasing the property of her mistress, the Marchioness. Manzano mentioned his brother by name twice in the slave narrative, Florencio. Okay, so Florencio is the brother that we're talking about, and he mentions him as well in the poem that we're going to study. The slave narrative juxtaposes the violence his enslavers inflicted on him with his family's affection for him and their devotion to his well-being. The sentience of enslaved African descendants in Manzano's poetry and prose is an assertion of Black Cuban humanity. Below, I discuss an incident from the slave narrative where Manzano's mistress accused him of stealing a coin, and punished him severely for it, I will quote in my English translation, leaving out the Spanish original. Quote, "They carried me to my dungeon. 4 days and nights I was there without the end of my arrest in sight. Finally, at the end of the 5th day, at 6 in the morning, they opened the door. All this time, I did not have anything to eat except what my brother and another person gave me, sliding the food under the door. From the foot of the stairs, my brother watched me with teary and swollen eyes, holding my old cloak and his little straw hat under his arm. He had not stopped crying since he had learned of my fate. We loved each other so dearly that whenever he ate half an orange, I would take the other half, and the other way around. We ate, played, ran every errand, and slept together. And so this union, tied by the indissoluble bonds of brotherly love, had been broken," end quote. The Marchioness of Prado Ameno, Manzano's enslaver, condemned him to what he poignantly described as his dungeon, quote, end quote. The dungeon, which was probably the coal cellar, shrouded Manzano in utter darkness. Manzano's dungeon deprived him of daylight, denied him human contact, and except for the little food that his brother and someone else secretly provided him, he was fed nothing. But the dungeon couldn't deprive him of love. That Manzano's brother risked his own safety to ensure his well-being not only bespoke the strength of their relationship, but also the love ethic his family practiced. So while he is being placed incomunicado, as we say in English, as we say in Spanish, is being placed in dark spaces, his brother is sneaking him a little bit of food. So that if one of them had an orange, he would share the other half with his brother. That's essentially what he's saying about the relationship that they had, his second brother. For Manzano and his brother, survival was priority, and their understanding of brotherly love was premised on togetherness, not self-interest. As Maria del Carmen Barcia notes, the family ties of enslaved individuals were based on consanguinity, but those relationships had serious ethical commitments. Manzano demonstrated that his biological family was a socio-cultural network of greatest consequence in his life. More than any other set of circumstances, the death of Manzano's mother, close to 1816, marks his transition from adolescence to adulthood. So it's the death of Manzano's mother that changes his life. That's when he decides he needs to escape the plantation in Matanzas and go to Havana. Manzano became responsible for settling her earthly affairs and procuring his own manumission. The plan was simple. Manzano had to emancipate himself so that he might care for his siblings, Florencio, Fernando, and Maria de Rosario. His mother explained the situation with perspicacity. Quote, Juan, here I carry the money for your liberty. You see that your father has already died, and you'll be a father to your siblings. They will not chastise you again, end quote. So Manzano's mother told him they will not chastise you. You will buy your own liberty, and you'll become a father to your brothers and your sister, his sister. But without warning, Manzano's mother died. This was the last straw, and Manzano fled the Matanzas sugar labor camp on horseback to Havana. Though Manzano escaped his mistress's sadistic grip by running away to Havana, he would ultimately achieve manumission when a group of white riders led by Domingo del Monte purchased his freedom in 1836. But 21 years later, his brother Florencio remained on the Matanzas sugar plantation. Manzano had not fulfilled his mother's charge. Manzano had not emancipated his brother But while Manzano was fulfilling his promise to Del Monte to write the slave narrative, he began to negotiate with his patron, with Del Monte, in order to free his brother. So I want to explain then that Manzano then begins the effort to free his own brother, and he does this through a letter. So I'm going to, of the 7 letters that remain in the correspondence between Manzano and Domingo del Monte, this is the last of those letters, signed 1835. So Manzano is writing the slave narrative and he's writing letters to Del Monte at the same time. And the last letter he writes, creo que en español es, I forget what we call it in English, but kind of PS. He writes a little note at the end of the letter. And that little note at the end of the letter I'm going to analyze here. Manzano's final letter to Del Monte, where he negotiated the purchase of his own freedom, contains a postscript, that's what we call it, alluding to the precariousness of his brother Florencio's predicament. Quote, Mr. Don Domingo, relying on the goodness that your grace has bestowed on me, I beg of you that you send the letter tomorrow in order that I might make the most of Monday to send it, Monday by whatever means available to me, because every day that passes my brother's fate becomes more dire. Mr. Don Domingo, your grace, if my brother's disgrace does not spur your compassion, then at least do this for the one that you raised out of the quagmire and into happiness. And may your intercession cut away the dangerous and sad consequences that befall me because of the rage of an aggravated master and the imprudent reflection of this poor creature who, guided by my fame, which is resounding in Matanzas, thought he might find some support in me, without knowing of my isolated impetus in this case. But for me, he is my brother, and his mistake has led to a state of hopefulness that is not well-founded. For that reason, I hope that your grace will use all of your influence and favor for your servant, end quote. So pay attention here to the tone of Manzano, to the language that he was pulled out of a quagmire, out of the swamp, which is a euphemism, a safe way of saying that you guys are in the process of purchasing my purchasing my freedom, and I appreciate that, but my brother also needs your help. It is remarkable that even while Manzano was still fulfilling part of the bargain, finishing the autobiography, so that Del Monte would purchase his freedom, he began to negotiate on his brother's behalf. Manzano scribbled these words at the end of one of his letters, but these words were more than an afterthought. They were a bold petition motivated by radical love. So Manzano doesn't mention Florencio by name. His message to Del Monte does adopt the same tone he used in the slave narrative to communicate his fraternal bond with his brother. In the letter, Manzano spoke of my brother's disgrace, this poor creature, and finally, he is my brother, and his mistake has led to a state of hopefulness that is not well-founded. Nearly 200 years later, Manzano's profound sense of empathy is palpable. Manzano did not straightforwardly request that Del Monte purchase his brother's freedom. Perhaps he wanted Del Monte to speak on his behalf with his former mistress to spare his brother's physical abuse. We do not know for sure. What is more, we do not know if Del Monte ever replied. Del Monte's letters to Manzano either perished or were destroyed by parties close to him. But the poem Manzano dedicated to his brother Florencio and published in 1838 suggests that the matter of his brother's freedom had not been solved. It had not been resolved. In 1838, Manzano published A Dream to My Second Brother to draw public attention to his brother's fate. And in this poem, he harnessed the power of African spirituality, invoking the memory of his deceased parents in a ritual meant to save his brother. In this lecture, I demonstrate that Manzano's A Dream to My Second Brother, which he dedicated to Florencio, enabled him to pursue both strategies of emancipation at once. One strategy of emancipation is to write the letters, write the postscript on the letter, and to write the poem in hope that Del Monte might be interested in raising money to free his brother, or intervene on behalf of his brother so his brother doesn't suffer as much. And the other strategy was to use ritual as a way of changing material reality so that his brother would be freed. Manzano disguised Bakongo Cuban practices in the language of Spanish Romanticism. He used the dream state, transfiguration, and magical flight. Writing about dreams enabled Manzano to communicate with his dead parents, to visit their burial grounds, and to transform himself into a bird that might rescue Florencio from the slave labor camp. By choosing to remember the ghosts of slavery, Manzano was able to express radical love for his younger brother. And I think this lets me go back. I want to go back here very quickly. And, okay. In Congolese cosmology, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail, the world is described as a mountain that sits above the kingdom of the dead. The world is a mountain, and the kingdom of the dead is below. And dreams are considered a portal for spirit visitation and spirit consultation. So dreams are are not thought of as the subconscious, but as visits from ancestors. Okay? Okay. Manzano dreamt about his brother, and he translated those dreams into poetry. His remarkable poem invites us into an intimate space rarely rendered visible in the lives of Black colonial Latin Americans. Manzano is vulnerable, tender in the poem, but he embraces a bold mission to emancipate his brother based on radical love. A Dream to My Second Brother invites us not only to explore Manzano's idea about freedom, but also his reflections on love. But Manzano offered his readers something else. Manzano's vision of radical love is expressed in the symbolic language of Congolese cosmology. I will demonstrate that Manzano's dream is a dream of Black liberation made possible by radical love. Let me talk a bit about dreams. Once again, let's try to imagine Juan Francisco Manzano and what his greatest dream would have been versus his truest nightmare. Dreams were an integral part of Manzano's African religious culture, but they were also a way for him to disguise his political intent, because anything can happen in a dream. Manzano was a recently liberated Black Cuban author. He was living still in a slave society that was experiencing incredible growth in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and his newly found freedom placed him at the helm of a new Black Cuban intellectual class, but it also made him vulnerable to government suspicions. So there are writings in the archive about Manzano's movements. He was described as someone who was very important to his community. And so the government was watching. We have the surveillance state is not born in the 20th century. The Spanish colonial government censored religious literature as a means to maintain social order and to prevent uprisings, because white Cubans did not want Cuba to become a Black state. Catholicism was the official religion of the Spanish Empire, and like all other vassals of Queen Isabella II, Manzano had been subjected to compulsory baptism at birth. So if Manzano wished to interpret his dreams in a way that resonated with his African religious culture, he had to do so in a way that disguised his intent. But there was something more at stake. Manzano could not abandon the community that had spawned him, so Manzano contended with several bodies of knowledge, and he engaged many theories of dreams: a Catholic theory of dreams, the idea of dreams from Spanish Romanticism, and a Bakongo-inspired theory of dreams. Manzano produced texts that I call self-dissembling, texts that disguise their intent, existing in an intervening space situated on the periphery but palatable to a metropolitan audience. So what I mean is he wrote in a way that used metaphor and euphemism so that the poems would read in a sensible way to his white readership, but convey a secret message to his black readership, whether the poem was read aloud by a black Cuban or remembered. Beneath the surface of his Hispano-Catholic poetry and prose, readers found an African ritual subtext. So with regard to the Catholic theory of dreams, what we have with the Catholics was a concern that messages from the devil essentially might be sent, particularly to women. They were concerned that women would carry messages from the devil in their dreams. And so they, at one point, required people to report dreams to the priest. What kind of dreams are you having? What were you told to do in that dream? They wanted to cut off additional, la palabra que estoy buscando, no representación, revelations. So the traditional African religions based on the principle that revelations from the spirit world, that they constantly come, that revelations from the spirit world can always be accessed. Whereas the Catholic Church wanted to control that, to say that the Bible is God's word, and if you think God is speaking to you, come talk to us, and we will help you to understand if it's God or the devil. Okay? So that was the threat there from the Catholic standpoint. The use of dreams is the most important literary device in Manzano's work. In Manzano's poems, not only Un sueño a mi segundo hermano, but in other poems, dreams functioned as a gateway from the material world into the beyond, from the everyday into the sacred. Manzano dreamed of a world where he might be reunited with his parents. The setting for Manzano's poem, A Dream for My Second Brother, is the forested mountain wilderness of Matanzas, known in Cuba as El Monte, or the mountain or the wilderness. The Cuban province of Matanzas held a particular significance for Juan Francisco Manzano because that's where his parents died, and that's where they had once been enslaved, and that's where they were buried. So I don't want to make a close correlation to Asian civilization, but you do have in both cases the reverence for ancestors in the sense that one has an ancestral home. There's a shrine there. So the cemetery might be a horrible place for Manzano, a locus horrendus, and the plantation would be a locus horrendus because that's where the cemetery would be, on the labor camp, the plantation, but also it would be a sacred space. So there's a great deal of conflict. What is more, Matanzas was where Manzano's brother Florencio was still enslaved, presumably under the former mistress that Sensei Ambo mentioned, the Marchioness of Prado Ameno, the second of two enslavers. So Manzano began the poem by addressing his younger brother by name. And I'm going to change slides. So I believe you have copies of the poem. Hi. Is that true? They have copies? Okay, great. So I'll show you first here. This is the original publication of the poem, Un sueño a mi segundo hermano. You can see the name Florencio mentioned twice in the slave narrative or autobiography, is also mentioned in the poem. And I really want to thank Ambo Sensei for the translation to Japanese. It's extraordinary. He didn't tell me that until today. That was fue una sorpresa para mí. It was a surprise. So let's look at, this is the end of it. You can see Manzano's name. So this is a manuscript that was provided me by Yasnai Cuesta, a black Cuban librarian. Bibliotecaria cubana, Yasnai Cuesta. Y le doy las gracias, and I really thank her. She was extraordinarily helpful in the building of the project. Here is the poem. The first, I think it's the first stanza I have here, first two stanzas. Okay, go back one. Florencio, quote, Florencio, you do know the sorrows that I grieve, how justified and understandable they torture my heart. Yes, you, who in bygone days would calm my suffering, or together with mine your tears also ran, end quote. Manzano and Florencio shared the same relationship to the past because they were brothers joined by indissoluble bonds, indisolubles lazos of brotherly love. Florencio pitied his older brother because he also had the experience that the justified and understandable sorrows of slavery, Manzano addressed Florencio in the second person, you, tú, to indicate the intimacy of their fraternal bond. He wrote the poem in the present tense because after being freed, the distressing wounds of the past continue to produce anguish. So it's interesting that the poem is in the present tense. He doesn't say we suffered. He says, you in bygone days would calm my suffering. So he's using there the present tense, and he's also using the imperfect tense as well. Though Manzano's memory of slavery represents an aesthetic choice, he certainly could have written about anything else. We must conclude that the psychic wound of racial slavery was too great to be discarded. Manzano chose to remember the kinship that he and Florencio once shared and the reciprocity that moved them to take care of each other, to console each other. In A Dream to My Second Brother, Manzano produced what is probably the most compassionate and humane image of black manhood in Cuban colonial literature. A Dream to My Second Brother explores the arbitrary and violent separation of enslaved families of African descent. The poem's fourth stanza introduces the dream-like or oniric space, el espacio onírico in Spanish, which is borrowed from Romanticism. And this leads to a series of images or representations that fragment time and space. So once again, the dream can be understood from the Catholic standpoint, that perhaps it's the vessel of the devil bringing negative ideas to people who may commit transgressions against God. And so the priest has to cipher through these dreams, and folks must confess to the priest what they have dreamt before acting on the dreams. But in Spanish Romanticism, there's a different theory of the dream. Dreaming is characterized by ascent and descent, going high and falling low, as we shall see in the poem. In the dream sequence, or in dreams, in Spanish Romanticism, descent creates a shifting and perpetually open space. They defy logic. Seldom do these dreams lead to a pleasant outcome. They don't end well. For the Romantics, the dream state is without logic. It exists outside of time and space. It is always open, in constant metamorphosis, and as such, dreams are spaces where the spirit world may exist. Manzano evoked the lack of temporality, incongruence, and the spontaneity of dreams to achieve two objectives. There's two things Manzano wanted to do with all these dreams that appear not only in this poem but in others. First, he wanted to envision the rescue of his brother from slavery, and he wanted to portray himself as a Cuban of African descent that was tied not only to African spirituality, but specifically to the spirituality, the Congolese-inspired beliefs. And I'm going to read from the text again in English translation. Please allow me to read one stanza in Spanish if you don't mind. It's very beautiful. Confuso y agobiado, de mil pesares lleno, la soledad buscaba, de los hombres huyendo, hacia el vecino monte, que de Quintana y Cerro domina y ameniza los lugares internos. Confused and aggrieved, burdened by 1,000 woes, I search for solitude, fleeing from man, toward the nearby wilderness where Quintana's hill adorns and dominates the inner spaces. I came to a forest, a refuge I frequent, to quarrel with myself and secretly lament. Whether from tiredness or lack of sleep, I close my eyes for a sweet and pleasant dream. So I want you to pay attention here to how he talks about being confused and aggrieved, how he does not mention that he was a slave here or an enslaved person. He says he's fleeing from man, Well, man here would be men of European descent, white Cuban men, because they were the ones that held the power of men in the patriarchal sense in the slave society. The others were not considered men, though they were biologically male. Pay attention to the emphasis on the mountain wilderness, which is tied into the idea of Congolese spirituality, where the world is a mountain divided between those who are living and those who are dead, separated by a river. And we're going to talk more about that. Pay attention to the inner spaces, those feelings that Manzano had, and the fact that this is not a mountain that you would find in some parts of the world with no vegetation, but not too different from the mountains that surround KYOTO, right? A forested mountain, which becomes his refuge. He's quarreling with himself, fighting with himself. He is crying by himself. This is a representation of black manhood that is sympathetic. Manzano is not a savage. Manzano is a man who wants to rebuild an African-descended family torn asunder by the pernicious effects of white supremacy. Finally, Manzano talks about the dream. It is clear from these verses that the dream sequence functions as the poem's guiding principle. To understand the poem deeper, its deeper and transculturated meanings, we must consider the Congolese theory of dreams, the African way of thinking about dreams traditionally, since the Bakongo ethnic group was the first African ethnicity brought to Cuba in the 1500s, and as sociologist and Cuba expert Walleen Dotson says, the Bakongo ethnicity laid the epistemological foundations for Congolese spiritual practices on the island. The late scholar, a Congolese scholar, Dr. Bunseki Fukiao, explains an African theory of dreams from a distinctly Congolese perspective. I want to make a move here. We're going to think about this wilderness, the mountain wilderness, which is a forested wilderness, as an African church, an African tabernacle, an African temple, searching for the kingdom of the dead. And so here I want to share a basic map of the continent, second largest continent in the world, second only to Asia. I don't think I have a pointer here. Do I have is this a pointer? Okay. I don't want to hit it. But I want us to pay attention to where you see the Democratic Republic of Congo, and more specifically Angola, and the Republic of the Congo and Gabon. That's the region we're referring to when we talk about West Central Africa. And northern Angola specifically is where the Bakongo ethnicity still is, and that's where the Kingdom of the Congo was. And so a large number of the early captives that the Portuguese are bringing in the 1500s are coming from northern Angola and the regions under the power of the Kingdom of the Congo. So in the period in which Nobunaga is doing his political work here in Japan, the Portuguese are starting a process that will lead to the collapse of a powerful African empire called the Congo by sifting people out of its neighboring communities and creating instability. So here is the region more closely. We're thinking about Gabon, the Republic of the Congo, what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we're thinking about northern Angola. We call it the Congo-Angola region. Here's a map, an older map to show you where the Kingdom of the Congo was. So excuse me for looking back towards the screen. This map is from 1750. You see the Kingdom of the Congo, but you also see outlying populations. South of the Kingdom of the Congo was the colony of Angola, as a Portuguese colony, founded in 1575. This is the period in which the Portuguese are still present, I think in Nagasaki and other parts of Japan. The first African captives transported to Cuba in the 1500s were from the Kingdom of the Congo. They hailed from the Bakongo ethnic group. And they were Kikongo speakers, but others would not have been Bakongo, but they spoke the language Kikongo. And prior to the year 1820, so this is slightly prior, Manzano by this time is a teenager. By 1820, the greatest number of captives that sent to Cuba came from West Central Africa, from this very region. This is an image of the capital city of the Kingdom of the Congo, Mbanza Congo, later São Salvador in Portuguese. But I'm showing you this because we rarely get an opportunity to see pre-colonial African cities, but also because I want you to notice that the city itself is sited on a hill intentionally because it's tied into that cosmology, to that understanding about the place of human beings within the universe. So the city is on, and the King's Palace, which is the largest building there, presumably, is on top of the mountain because that's where the living are. That's where the king is. The king is in the land of the living. Anything below the river is the land of the dead. So symbolically, it's placed there for that reason. And this was published in Ophir Dapper's book, The Description of Africa. For our purposes, this is Matanzas. Oh, sorry about that. This is Matanzas. So I took a picture of the bridge so you can see just how deep the fall is. And I wanted you to see that bird because Manzano becomes a bird in the poem. So that reminds me of the mountains around KYOTO. Not the same, but it reminds me of that. Okay. Now this is important for us from the standpoint of how this cosmology function, this notion of the universe and the place of human beings within it. So the graveyard, instead of being a frightening place as it might be in Hollywood movies, was instead a keeper of the persistence of the spirit. You go to the graveyard in order to honor those who have passed on. And this cosmogram, which you see on my left, your right, the horizontal line divides the world of the living. So that part above, that's Mbanza Congo. That's the capital, symbolically speaking. And below is the world of the dead. The mountain of the dead is known as Impimba in Kikongo, Impimba. And the creator is Nzambi Mpungu, is sited at the top of the cosmogram and the dead are below. So the traditional capital city was on top of the mountain, not only for defensive purposes, certainly, but because that's where the creator is understood to be symbolically. And so this will become important for the reading of the poem. I think the next image is back to the poem itself. Okay. Bunseki Fukiao says that a dream, an endosi, is a voiceless communication. It is at the same time a means and a message. This message can be audible, pictorial, or scenic. The dream can be a reflection of diurnal activities, daily activities, a repetition of past activities, a projection of one's own activities and imagination in the future. But most importantly, it can be a warning about a future or imminent event, good or bad news. A dream interpreter, and I want you to remember this term, it's in Kikongo, Mbangudi Andozi is a term whose sensitivity, is a person whose sensitivity to the awareness of waves, symbols, and meanings is very high. Manzano gave meaning to the array of symbols and images he encountered in his dream. He translated those into poetry. Manzano was a dream interpreter in this poem. He was the Mbangudi Andozi. His sensitivity and awareness gave meaning to the symbols. In Spanish literature, the wilderness represented the tranquility of nature. It was the locus amenus. It was an idealized concept of nature. Nature was understood in this way. I analyzed Manzano's idealized space within the poem's autobiographical and ethno-historic context. The wilderness appears as much more than a bucolic space, a peaceful space. It emerges as a transcendental trope from Manzano, who said, quote, I came to a forest, a refuge where I frequent, in order to secretly lament, quote, end quote. So the seventh stanza is somewhat autobiographical, since in the slave narrative, Manzano said he visited the forested hills to get away from his violent captor. In this way, the forest was Manzano's refuge from his dungeon. Remember the dungeon and remember the pillory. When Manzano escapes from the sugar labor camp, he escapes his dungeon. He is transformed from a slave into a maroon, from a submissive subject, who is not a man according to the Spanish patriarchy, into a free and rebellious one. In that nearby wilderness, covered with trees and dense vegetation, Manzano achieves autonomy. Within the forested mountain wilderness, Manzano conjured the memory of the Maroon community, and he gestured toward a Congolese-inspired context that made contact with ancestors possible. So Manzano invoked the Congolese-Cuban concept of the forested wilderness in three ways. The dream is a portal for spirit visitation. El Monte, or the mountain wilderness, is a refuge from slavery. Remember, he's escaping man, like it was for the Maroons. Excuse me. I'm looking for this note here. Okay. And Manzano performs a ritual to pay homage to his parents. So his parents now appear in this dream. Okay. Another significant thing I'll say very quickly, without going into too much detail for the sake of time, is that Matanzas is also significant because not only was it a major port in bringing in African captives, but it became the hub of the Cuban sugar production industry. So the white Cuban sugar production industry produced not only the crop, sugarcane, but refined the sugar as well, all in the same place, which might not sound remarkable today, but was remarkable in the 19th century. Okay, but it was also a place of Maroon stronghold. So you had a lot of escaped or runaway Africans that lived there. So Manzano's evoking the notion of running away to the hills. Manzano's representation of the forested mountain wilderness, requires an explanation based in Congolese cosmology as a system of religious belief. In Flash of the Spirit, Robert Ferris Thompson, may he rest in peace, says that cosmological thought in the Kingdom of the Congo was based on notions of continuity and equilibrium between the spiritual and the material realm. The indestructibility of the spirit was a sacred principle among the Bakongo. Wyatt McGaffey says, quote, "The sun in its rising and setting is a sign of this cycle, and death is merely a transition in this process of change." Thompson explains that traditional Congolese architecture and royal ceremonies are patterned on a quest for centeredness and equilibrium, hence Mbanza Congo being on the top of a hill. So I want to move towards the end here and to look at the poem once again, the English translation. Okay, very good. Oh, there's one more. Oh. Okay, great. Quote, "Having seen so much from the air, I eagerly looked for the center of the earth to land my flight. I gather my feathers, I slightly tilt my chest, and turning in circles, I come down again, in a well-aimed descent into the heart of Matanzas, from where I gaze on that terrible place. There lie the remains, the miserable remains of our parents who gave us our first being," end quote. Manzano's metamorphosis into a bird enables the poetic self to overcome temporal and spatial limitations so that flight becomes what Joe James Figueroa would call an act of cultural marronage, cimarronaje cultural. As evident throughout the poem, Manzano understood the wilderness to be an African tabernacle, a sacred space imbued or present with all types of spirits, both good and evil. There are three different modes of descent in the poem. Remember that in Spanish Romanticism, you go up, you come down in the poem. Descent into the kingdom of the dead to see his parents, descent onto the plantation to save the fraternal figure, and descent into chaos, which is the poem's Icarus moment. Manzano said, quote, "I eagerly looked for the center of the earth," end quote, in reference to the Congolese principle of the center of the earth as a sign of equilibrium between the spiritual and the natural realm. And again, the Congolese idea that human remains of ancestors are sacred. Manzano wrote, quote, "In a well-aimed descent into the heart of Matanzas from where I gaze, there lie the miserable remains of our parents who gave us our first being," end quote. The word miserable suggests that the bones cry out. They bear witness to the violence of slavery, to the violence that burial was intended to silence forever. Manzano's verses bespeak the Congolese idea about the persistence of life after death. Ferris Thompson wrote, quote, "That continuity might be characterized as a reinstatement of the Congo notion of the tomb as a charm for the persistence of the spirit." Manzano paid homage to the mortal remains of his deceased parents. And Walleen Dotson writes, quote, "Within the sacred nature of their function, material objects are necessarily participants in processes of atmospheric change that allow the entry of spirits into sacred spaces," end quote. Again, in Lidia Cabrera's work, El Monte, the wilderness is a space of spirits with diverse spiritual forces, sacred plants, as her black informants declared. And I won't read the quote, but they describe El Monte, they describe the forested wilderness as an African tabernacle. They say that it should be respected as you would respect a church. Manzano's vision was a dream deferred. His well-aimed descent devolved into chaos when the political winds suddenly changed, and like Icarus, Manzano fell from the sky. Manzano described the abrupt change thus, quote, "From so clear and beautiful, so gentle and serene, the night became dark," end quote. Manzano characterized his change of fortunes as horrendous warfare, quote, end quote, in the firmament. Darkness is the active metaphor to describe an emancipatory vision that had devolved into a nightmare. Like Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, Manzano's figurative wings melted into nothingness. And in a final act of brotherly love, Manzano exclaimed to save not my life, but rather the one who is nearly lost. Like Icarus, the precipitous descent. And I want to show here this image from Peter Gawi, this painting of the flight of Icarus. So now we're imagining a black Icarus. Manzano becomes like Icarus in the poem, where he loses control. The analogy is the attempt to free his brother after achieving his own freedom, is flying too close to the sun, is hoping for too much. I want to go back to the poem itself to read the text. It's really an extraordinary poem that should be added to anthologies and studied. And I think its recent translation into Portuguese and now into Japanese is going to help contribute to that. Ashe. I think I got it there. Okay. These last verses are very, very important. Okay. Let me make sure that I'm on the right page. 26, 27, 28, okay. I'm starting here with, but since I couldn't, okay. Quote, "But since I couldn't quell in my heart the tender impressions of sweet brotherly love, anxious, I descend to find the dear object of my affection as a strong Ethiopian overcoming his toils. I see him recognize me. I kiss him. He embraces me. And oh God, in this embrace, I feel my affection grow. Let us flee, I told him, from this horrible place, more terrible in my view than hell itself. Let us flee, dear brother. Let us leave on the wind. Let us abandon forever our enemy soil." Remembering the innocent games and the mother's love of those tender years, Manzano cried for the lost innocence, companionship, and familial union of his youth. As Hortense Spiller said, quote, "Touch is probably the single sensual realm that most defines the difference between enslaved and free, and touch may be the first measure of what it means not to be enchained anymore. I think I may have one more. I want to read the last stanzas and I will conclude. Okay. I will conclude. Quote, I traversed the mountains and I judged myself great Lord of the winds, leaving behind the nations of America to save not my life, but rather the one that is nearly lost. Like Icarus, the precipitous descent, I am surprised and I awaken, searching in my arms for the one that my dream took away. End quote. Juan Francisco Manzano. Arigato.
十分だと思うんですけれど、まとめをさせていただきたいと思います。でそして僕の方から少しコメントもさせていただきたいと思います。で今日の、ペトウェイ先生のお話でしたけれど、フランシスコ・マンサノの、詩について、それほど研究が進んでいるわけではなくて、で先行研究についても最初の方でいくつか紹介されましたが、基本的に実際詩を読んでいただいた方は分かるかと思うんですけれど、パッと見るとその神、つまりなんか一見するカトリックの神になんか言及しているようですし、あとジュピターであったりとか、それからダイダロスとかクレタ島とかってギリシャ神話の話が出てきていて、一見すると全然そのアフリカ的なものがあるようには見えないんですよね。ということで、これまでの先行研究では、結局この、マンサノというのは、不十分な白人の西欧の伝統に基づいた、スペイン語を使っている、書き言葉をちゃんと使っているけれども、不十分な模倣であるというような先行研究であったり、必ずしもそのアフリカ性というものがこのマンサノの詩にあるというふうに認められてきたわけではなかったんですね。それに対して、今回このコンゴのバコンゴのこの精神性、宗教観というものがこの詩にはこう込められているんだということを指摘されたということが、おそらくは非常に重要な発見じゃないかなというふうに僕は考えています。で講演の中では僕の方でも少しご紹介しましたけれど、フランシスコ・マンサノはもともとは奴隷で、両親が死んだ後に家族兄弟がいたわけですよね。弟たち、妹も一人いたわけですが、彼らの面倒を見るようにというふうに、母親から遺言のように言われていたけれども、奴隷という身分で、実は両親にも少し財産はあったんだけれども、それも実はこのプラドアメの公爵夫人に奪われてしまって、ほとんど何も残っていないという状況にありました。そういったことがあって、子供の面倒、一人で逃げたっていうふうに見えるかもしれないですけど、ただ自分のためにやったっていうことだけではなくて、自分のその兄弟たちの面倒を見るためには、まず自分が奴隷という身分から解放されなければこれはどうしようもないというような考え方もあったということなんですね。で実際にさまざまな拷問を受けていた中で逃亡を決めたという経緯がありました。でその、拷問を受けているエピソードについても一つ触れていただきましたけれど、4日間地下牢に閉じ込められて食べ物も何も出されずにっていう日が続いたと。その中で、フロレンシオこの詩で言及されている弟なんかがこの閉じ込められている部屋の、ドアの下から何か食べ物を忍び込ませてくれて、それでなんとか命をつないでいた。でその弟のフレレンシオなんかはもう涙を流しながら自分のためにそういった協力をしてくれた、自分の命を危険にさらしてまでそういうことをしてくれた、そういう兄弟関係があったんだということについて話をしていただきました。で逃亡してからのこの詩については1838年に書かれたという詩です。で先ほど言っていたそのマンサノの逃亡っていうのは1810 1817 era la fuga de Manzano, ¿verdad? 17, ¿no? 17, sí, ¿verdad? Alrededor, ya. Ya。大体1817年頃に逃亡した。で、その時から考えると、この詩が書かれた1838年っていうのはもう20年ぐらい経過しているということです。なので、自分は逃亡して、白人作家たちの協力を得て自由にはなり、で、ある程度その詩作品も発表されて、名声を獲得しているけれども、弟はそのままっていう状況が続いていたわけですね。彼としては、やっぱり弟たちを助けたいという強い願いがあったわけだけれども、まだその頃っていうのは、彼にとってはもう手の打ちようがないというような状況であったということです。なので、なんとかドミンゴ・デル・モンテというその反奴隷主義文学サークルへのリーダーですね、に手紙を書いて、なんとかこのフロレンシオを救ってくれないかという、まだ自分が自由を得ていない段階からそういう交渉するようなことを手紙の最後につけていたという紹介もありました。で、書かれた時が1838年、つまりもう20年が経過した中で、結局彼は、マンサノは弟のフロレンシオを助けることができずにいたわけですね。その中で書かれた詩、そういう背景があるというご説明がありました。で、いよいよその、詩の分析の方に入るわけですけれども、今回の、講演においては3つのテーマを最初に挙げておられました。一つは夢が精神世界への入り口として詩の中で利用されているということ。それからラディカルラブですね。ラディカルラブ。この、愛なんですけれど、ラディカルな愛、あまり馴染みがない語ではありますが、例えば恋人同士の恋愛ということではなくて、今回この講演の中で言われたラディカルラブっていうのは、この結構政治的な目的が含まれた実践であるという話がありました。それは必ずしもその個人のための利益ではなくて、家族であったり、社会的な利益を考えた自由であったりとか、誰かを救うという目的を、あるいは正義感を持っての愛というのがラディカルラブであると。そういった愛情を持って、この詩が書かれているという話をされます。それが2つ目のテーマとして、話があったと思います。そして3つ目にアフリカの精神性、自由の実践がある。この3つについて講演をされました。で、具体的な詩の分析についてぜひ翻訳の方お手元にあるかと思いますが、オンラインの方ももし途中ご参加でしたら、チャットの方でお送りしています。もし見当たらないということがあったらまた再送しますので、はい、コメントしていただければというふうに思います。で、この詩の中の夢ですね、先ほども言ったように、一つはカトリックの考え方がこの中に出てくる、その神セールスプレーモーっていうのが出てきたりとか、オーディオスミオっていうふうにカトリックの神への言及と考えられるものがあります。そういった宗教性が書かれているっていうことが伺われる部分がある。他方でこの夢というのがスペインロマン主義の詩の一つのテーマであるという話がありました。で、そのスペインロマン主義の詩において夢というのがこの上昇とそれから下降というその2つの動き、を持っていると。で、その夢というのは時間とか空間の外側にあって非常にオープンで変容する空間であり、精神性が描かれうる空間であるということで、このマンサノはこの詩を執筆するにあたって、やはり検閲というものを意識していたわけなんですね。つまりあまりその奴隷制に対する反対であったりとか、あるいは言葉だけでもその奴隷解放とかいうような言葉がもし含まれていたら、それはやはり検閲に引っかかって、自分の身を危うくするっていう可能性もあったわけです。そのような制約がある中で、この夢というものが自分の思想であったりそういったものを象徴的に表現する、ある種のカムフラージュの手段となったという話があったかと思います。 でその夢において、一つではその、カトリックの宗教的なものが込められていたり、あるいはこのギリシャ神話ですね、ダイダロスの話とか、イカロスとか、そういったなんかこの夢の中に出てくる物語とこう類似するようなギリシャ神話が、描かれている、そういったものから見ると一見こう非常に西洋文学にのっとった詩であるように見えて、一番重要なポイントとして指摘されていたのがやはりバコンゴインスピレーションに基づく夢であるというところだったと思います。つまりペトウェイ先生の言葉を使うならば、その黒人にとってのそのアフリカの精神が息づくこうサブテクストがこの詩にはあるんだという、黒人の自由が表現された、オールタナティブな言説がこの詩にはあるということがペトウェイ先生のお話の一つの重要なポイントだったかと思います。ちょっと詩について全体的にどんな話やったかということを、最後に少しまとめとして確認しておきたいと思うんですけれど、最初の1ページ目のところを見ていただきたいと思うんですが、フロレンシオに対して、親密な間柄を分からせるような語り口で、自分が苦しんでいるということ、そしてある夢を見たんだと、それを聞いてくれというふうな語りかけからこの詩は始まるんですね。で、2ページの方に、移っていただきたいんですが、でここではこの2ページのそうですね、コンフッソから始まる詩節ですけれど、下から4行目のところにあるボスケという言葉に注目されていたかと思います。でこの英語でのウィルダネスですかね、そういった未開の場所といったもの、西洋においてはこう何か穏やかな自然の理想的な場所というようなイメージを持たれるところ、これがそのアフリカの特にこのキューバのコンテクストにおいて、アフリカ人の奴隷にとってはそれは全く違った象徴性を持つという話があったかと思います。そこというのは、一つにはそのバコンゴの、インスピレーションを含むその精神性から言うと非常に神聖な場所ということなんですね。そしてこのマタンサという地域的、地域の環境にも関係しますけれど、そこはプランテーションから逃れた逃亡奴隷たちの住処にもなっていた場所でした。そこにこのマンサノが密かに隠れて不平をつぶやくというふうな一節というのがここに書かれてあります。でそういう場所にいるというところがやっぱり一つ重要で、そこからの夢のシークエンスが始まっていくんですよね。まぶたが重たくなっていつの間にか眠ってしまったと。でここからマンサノの夢に見た夢のペットウェイ先生の言葉を借りるなら解釈ですよね。おそらくいろんなイメージが出てきたと。それをこういうふうに言葉で表現するということは、つまりその夢に出てきたものをマンサノなりにこれ言葉に解釈して表現しているということになります。で鳥になるんですね。マンサノは一対の、羽が豪華な色とりどりの羽に覆われた翼がいつの間にか自分には生えていて、そして飛翔を始めるっていうのがこの2ページの後半になります。で3ページ目の方に移って、いただいて、でそこで神が作った創造物を見て感嘆するという、一つ目の段階がありますが、この3ページの真ん中ぐらいからですね、ここ僕はちょっとペトウェイ先生の話を聞いてすごくこう刺激を受けたところなんですけれど、この短い4行の真ん中の施設ですが、Visto tanto en el aire buscaba con anhelo el centro de la tierra para posar mi vuelo。翼を休めるためのこの大地の中心を求めて、なんか何気に読み飛ばしてしまいそうなんですけど、この大地の中心という言葉に込められているところに、このコンゴ の宗教にとって非常に重要な場所が象徴的に表現されているっていうご説明があったかと思います。つまり明らかな形ではそういったものが表現されているわけではないんだけれども、こういう本当に何気なく読み飛ばしてしまいそうなところにその宗教性が読み取れるということを、指摘されていたかと思います。そしてこの3ページの下の方でマタンサスに降りるんですね。実際に彼が幼少期を過ごしたマタンサスに降ります。でここでまた一つアフリカの宗教観との非常に重要な関係性で指摘されたのがこの異骸なんですね。良心の異骸を見つけるというところ。ここに僕の最初の説明でもありましたけれど、この精神性、死者とか祖先の霊というものに対する崇拝があって、例えばその骨が時に呪術として使われたりというようなその今後系の宇宙観というものが見えるということがペトウェイ先生のご指摘でした。そして実際にここで具体的にね何か儀式があるとかそういうことは書かれてはないんですね。でもこの描写の後にマンサノはその幼少期の思い出をずっと書き連ねていく。あたかもこの母親あるいは両親が彼にその記憶を思い出させるかのような描写が4ページの方で続いていくんですよね。で涙を流すっていうシークエンスがあります。そしてここでさらっとこのパレンケっていう言葉が逃亡奴隷の住処のことを指します。イタリックになっているのは原文でそうなって、僕が引用した文献ではそうなっていました。逃亡奴隷の住処の山脈を見て、森の農園、彼がかつて奴隷としていた森の農園を見て、でそこから下校し弟に再会するんですね。実際には会ってなかったけれどもそこから下校して弟が20年ぶりということですね。実際には会ってない期間20年経った弟が幼かった弟が屈強な奴隷として働いているところを見たような、そういう夢ですけれど見つけると。で彼らは抱擁し、5ページに移りますが、まさにダイダロスとそれからその息子のイカロスと同様に飛翔してそこから逃げるというシークエンスへと移っていきます。空を飛んで敵の土地を永遠に捨て去ろうというふうに言って逃げていく。そしてある程度気持ちよく得意になって飛んでいく、自由になって、この自由でっていう言葉もさらっと忍ばせていますけれど、この当時においては非常に危険な単語ではあると思います。風の主人になったような気分で飛んでいくけれども、6ページになってそれが急展開するんですね。その様子をそのギリシャ神話のダイダロスとそれからイカロスに例えながらも前に進んでいく、自分たちがまさに逃亡奴隷ですよね。逃亡奴隷となって空を飛んでいって逃げていくというようなその状況をギリシャ神話に重ねながらも得意にはなっていたんですけれど、6ページの後半様子が一転します。一瞬にして晴れ渡った空が暗闇になって、で自然現象の大戦争のような状況になってしまう。これが最後の方です。で7ページになりますが、でイカロスが実際に太陽に近づきすぎて墜落したように、2人はそれまでの自由を得たかのような飛翔から墜落していくわけです。そして最後にはこのジュピターの稲妻が放たれるかのようなところで夢から覚めるんですね。夢からされて、自分は弟を抱いて逃げていたはずなのにその弟がいないっていうことに気づいて目から覚めるというのが詩の結末になっています。でペットウェイ先生も言われてましたけど、僕自身も何というか、これは前に目にしたことがあった詩ではあったんですが、もう一回こういうふうに読み直してみたときに、単にこの西洋文学的なギリシャ神話が盛り込まれていたり、神への呼びかけが行われている詩だけではないということにすごく気づかされて、その 彼の幼少期の過去の記憶であったり奴隷制のことであったり、それからその今後系の宗教観というものがこういろいろ表現象徴的に表現された詩なんだということに気づかれて、非常に刺激を受けましたというのが、僕のとりあえずのコメントになります。